May we preach together in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer. Amen. My friends in Christ, the theme of leadership, the selection and the grooming of leaders, is thick in the air today. If you look at the gospel reading, the departing leader, Jesus, is praying for his disciples after just having given them final instructions. And as you can see, there's a certain poignancy and tenderness to his prayer because he knows that he is saying goodbye and that he's passing on the work to them. And if you look at the book and the Acts of the Apostles, we're now getting into the stories of the apostles after the physical life of Jesus. And they are starting with what? Replacing the departing Judas with a new apostle, Matthias. And as we know, in the context of our own church life, we are preparing for the departure of our beloved rector, Ed Bacon, who will be retiring in a year. And our rector search committee and our transition life committee are very busy working on the selection of a new rector for our church and also preparing us all for this transition time in our lives. And if that weren't enough, John Bruno, the Right Reverend John Bruno, our diocesan bishop, is retiring and has called for the election of a coadjutor bishop. And at the General Convention in 1 month, we are going to elect a new presiding bishop for the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. So when I prayed to God, gee, what should I preach about today? It seemed somewhat obvious. Now, the interesting thing about the theme of leadership is that it is closely tied to the ministry of Jesus. Most people, when they picture the life of Jesus, the first thing they will mention is, oh, he healed the sick, an important thing. Or the miracle of the loaves and fishes, he fed 4,000 or 5,000 people by dividing those fish and loaves up. Well, that may be, but what he spent most of his time doing was recruiting, training, and deploying leaders. If you look at the commands that Jesus gives when he uses the imperative voice, something I've been studying in Spanish recently, his most frequent command is, be not afraid. And the second most frequent is, follow me. It occurs in all the Gospels, and if you search for the word follow in the Bible, you find out that Jesus is saying it quite a lot. And the other thing that the Gospels say, is that Jesus was speaking to a crowd, and then a large crowd began to follow him. It's fascinating how often the word occurs. Now, Jesus was not creating a fan club. What he was doing was drawing people into the life of his ministry, what we now call the church, attracting them to it and training them through his teaching and how to be leaders. But I don't think that he was just trying to be the best HR manager in the Middle East. It wasn't that there was this huge body of work and he had to hire the right people to do it. It was that Jesus understood that in leading, we are developed and honed into the best beings we can be. It's through leading in some way, not holding back, that we experience the changes that cause us to grow. What this means is that to follow Jesus, to consider ourselves a disciple of Jesus, whether we are actively Christian or simply somebody who admire him and want to imitate him, to follow Jesus is to be a leader in one way or another. And it is the work of the church also to attract, to form, to deploy leaders, to call them into that work. When I look at this prayer of Jesus, and I like to imagine myself sitting there with the apostles, I think I would have been intimidated had I been sitting there on that day, because there's an implication behind his words that he's going away. And remember, the apostles at the time really didn't have a clear picture of what was about to happen. And I think I would also feel insecure. I think I would say, wait, you can't go yet. I can't do what you do. I don't do it well enough. You stay and do it yourself. But in fact, Jesus expresses complete confidence in the disciples sitting in that room with him. He says that they are untainted by the world. Now remember, they're sitting there and he's sort of talking to God in their presence. And he says, protect them because they are untainted by the world. Then he goes one step further. He says that he, Jesus himself, has been glorified by what the apostles have done in his name. He has been glorified by them, not by God. Well, he has been by God too, but he's talking about what they have done for him. He shows confidence in them, he prays for them, and he gives them work to do. In this sense, Jesus is reflecting some of the best theories about high-quality pedagogy, that is how we teach, the best, most effective ways of teaching and coaching. As I was preparing to preach today, I was reflecting upon some of my the favorite leaders from my past, and there have been many. And one of the people who came to mind for me was a teacher from my high school years, Nick Ferentinos, and I believe he is streaming today. So hello, Nick, if you're there watching from home. Nick was my English teacher for 3 years. He taught English and journalism to me. And one of the things that Nick did when he retired is that he became a mentor to teachers who mentor other teachers. So new teachers get a mentor teacher, and Nick taught other teachers how to be mentors to others. In his teachings, one of the things he emphasized to fellow mentor teachers is that they should focus on people's strengths and build upon people's strengths. An effective teacher of teachers shows them what their strengths are and says, amplify this, do more of it. You do not tell teachers, new teachers, what their weaknesses are and then say, please get better at that, shore that up. No, you focus on what they're doing really well. And then he says, how do you know? Well, the 3 ways you know what you are good at and what you should be strengthening. Well, first of all, people tell you what you're good at. And if you don't know, ask people, what am I good at? Second, a new teacher should build upon previous successes. What has the teacher done well in the past? What lesson plan went well? What even moment in their life went well? And then figure out where their strengths were in that. And finally, he says that they should follow their personal passion, that they should do what they love. Now remember that Jesus says in this prayer that he wants his joy to be made complete in his followers. It's supposed to be fun. So there I was reading on this website about what Nick had been teaching other teachers about teaching. And I reflected on those 3 years in his classroom. He worked with me very closely my senior year because I was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, and so he coached me on coaching the editors of various sections of the newspaper and the writers and the reporters and the editors and so on. In all that time of 3 years, I never remember him telling me my weaknesses. I never remember any criticism. What I remember was him telling me what my strengths were and telling me, do more of this. Do more of this. That was great the way you did that. Now, contrast that with weak leaders in our lives. And I'm fortunate to have had very few of them. But as I was reflecting upon weak leaders, I was reminded of my softball coach when I was 13 years old. Yeah. And I was at bat one day, and I was a great third baseman for a left-hander, but I was not the greatest batter in the world. And so I kept swinging at a low pitch. And the pitcher figured me out, and she pitched 3 low pitches in a row, and I swung at them all. And the third time, he was standing at third base, and he yelled at me, "What's wrong with you? Are you blind?" I was humiliated, and I have never forgotten that moment. I mean, it just rose up in me, and here it is, right here in my chest. Thank you, Coach. To follow Jesus means to lead well. The purpose is to empower, to encourage, and to love people into their best selves, their best batting average, their best teaching, their best work at the greeter's table. That is what we do when we form leaders. Leading well is part of the church's work, and so David Gortner, who is an Episcopal priest, has been teaching this in a series of courses on congregational leadership at the Virginia Theological Seminary. He's written a series of articles that he's published in places such as the Anglican Theological Review, And in these articles, he talks about the need for strong leaders in the church in the hopes that we will recruit and groom leaders better than we may already be doing. He makes a distinction between effective leaders and less effective leaders, as he says. So effective leaders follow several different strong ways of behavior. They have mental habits, whereas ineffective leaders tend to fall into two camps. The ineffective leaders tend to be either highly controlling, everything has to be my way, or I'm going to do everything, or they're over here, they're way too accommodating because they're afraid to address conflict and they're insecure, so they cave into everybody and they don't ever actually accomplish the goals and the mission of their church. Effective leaders have these mental habits that he calls habitus, the habitus of mindfulness. And what he describes is various mental practices that are actually a spiritual practice of bringing out the best in oneself and others. So, for example, effective leaders are very good at reframing their perspectives. Reframing perspectives means that given the new information that is coming at you as you're addressing a situation or an environment, you are able to enlarge or shift or change or adjust your perspective. In addition, an effective leader is able to do the same for others that they are leading. They are able to get others to shift or enlarge, to challenge their perspectives. So there's this constant adjustment that's going on everybody's part. In addition, effective leaders are very good at recruiting co-leaders, at drawing others into the work. And they do this because they pay attention to the interests and the networks of information and people that other members of their group or organization have. They attract them into the work and they groom them into forms of leadership themselves. And another thing in this spiritual practice, this habitus of mindfulness that he describes, is that effective leaders are highly attuned to the emotional lives of the people they lead. They're also attuned to their own emotional lives, but they are paying attention to what's going on in the emotional lives of the people they lead, and those emotional lives matter to them. What this means is that effective leaders are constantly adapting and changing. Notice that everything they're doing is other-centered. It is not about themselves. It is not about getting everybody to do that objective over there that I'm pretty sure is where we should be going. Rather, it's about gathering people's interests and information and networks and so on to address a mutually agreed upon goal or mission. It is other-centered. In other words, these leaders must also follow. Just as followers of Jesus must become leaders, leaders must, to a certain extent, follow. It doesn't mean that they cave into every prevailing wind, but when there's a sea change, they look at their rudder and they say, maybe we need to steer a little bit this way for now. They adjust, and that is, in a way, following the currents of their time and their community. It's probably obvious to Christian leaders, in the context of the church, that we are called to follow. In purely practical terms, I just named the hierarchy of the church to you. I named the presiding bishop, and the rector. We all, most of us, have somebody in authority over us. But in purely spiritual terms, we consider God and Christ our authority. We hope to be following God, and we say that Jesus is in charge. So it's our job as followers of Jesus to figure out what he is asking of us and to follow in that way. Now, when I say we are all called to be leaders, I don't necessarily mean that we're all called to lead in a highly visible and famous way. We're not all called to be the governor of California or the senior warden of the vestry or the person who leads the strike, the march against Walmart to get a living wage at Walmart. Not necessarily, although I hope somebody out there is doing that right now. I think that God often works in small ways, and that to God it does not matter whether we are leading in such a visible way or whether we are leading in sometimes hidden, quiet ways off in a corner. I think sometimes God does her most amazing work when she is working off to the side with an individual. I saw an amazing example of this in one of those YouTube videos that gets around the internet. And it's a story about a teenage boy at a school in Ontario. His father had died when he was in high school, and he suffered from social anxiety. His mother decided that they needed a change of environment, so she moved herself and her son, her teenage son, from their small town to an urban school, a much bigger high school. And when they got there, her son, or this boy, put a picture of his father in his locker on the door so that he could think of his father every day at school. Well, the kids made fun of him. They tore the picture down, they ripped it, and they taunted him for grieving for his father. Things got worse at this high school, at this large high school. And he said that he retreated even further into his social anxiety and was not able to engage with anybody, that he would sit all alone in the cafeteria. And then he said one day at home, he got mad. He said, I want them to know who I am. So he went to school, and it was the uncanniest of things. He just held open the front door of the school and said, hello, good morning, how are you? And if you watch this video, just Google Canadian boy opens door, and you'll find it. He looks stiff and a little bit nervous. He's like 6'2", big guy. He looks a little bit nervous, but he's saying, good morning, hello. And they're just streaming in. And then in their schools, they have stairways with internal doors, and he would stand at the top of the stairways between the passing of classes, and he would say hello to kids. Now, they interviewed several kids at the high school, and they quote this kid as saying, well, at first we thought it was really weird, and it's like he was acting like a doorman, but then we really got to like it. Because he dramatically transformed the culture of what was probably your average everyday high school. The people filming this interviewed other high school boys who I think also may have been emotionally and verbally bullied at school, because they sort of were sitting like this with their heads hanging like this, and they're saying, well, you know, it used to be really bad here. But now that he's been opening doors and greeting people, other people have started to open doors and greet people, and they're saying, hello, how are you, to each other in the hallways. The principal, the teachers say he has dramatically transformed this high school. He was elected homecoming king. It gets better. It gets better. He overcame some of his social anxiety, and he is now giving motivational talks at middle schools where he talks to middle school kids about bullying and how they can overcome it by getting out of their shells. It's an amazing story of transformation, and I don't know what compelled him to do that except, yes, thank you, Georgia Russell, God, appreciate that. And notice that he was all by himself, and all he did was open the door and he greeted them. He did the job of our ushers and our greeters. Never doubt how important it is for you to stand there at that door and simply smile and say hello. We need it. We need that warmth. Oh. Oh, it's the greeters and the ushers. There are a lot of them, 60 greeters, and I don't know how many ushers, probably about 80 of them. There's a lot of them here. One of the things that appeals to me about this boy's story, this young man's story, is that he was so transparent and honest about his situation. The honesty was almost disarming. Now, Gortner says that honesty is another aspect that you see in the lives of effective leaders. He says that effective leaders are very honest about what's going on in their environment. They're very open about having problems, about exposing conflicts and resolving them, even if they themselves are involved in that conflict. Ineffective leaders, on the other hand, are afraid, and so they hide. They are not honest and open about what's happening because they're afraid to address the conflict, afraid to displease others. So honesty is crucial. And I want to demonstrate how crucial honesty is by giving you an example of how dishonesty can completely undermine a leadership effort. When my daughter was 2.5 years old, I was going out on a date. And my dad came over to babysit for me. And I said, now, Dad, there's Coca-Cola and some chocolate goodies in the fridge, but please don't give Georgia any caffeine because, you know, she'll be bouncing off the walls and she'll never get to sleep tonight. And my dad said, gotcha. I see all the grandparents. So I come back from my date at about 10:30 or 11, and I open the door, and here's what I see. George is jumping up and down on the sofa like it's a trampoline, leaping from the sofa to the chair, and when she sees me, she sort of leaps 4 feet in the air, runs over the door, runs into me, and grabs my legs and says, "Mommy, Mommy, Nunu gave me chocolate and Coke, and he told me not to tell you." Thank you, Dad. Now, what we had here was a failure to communicate. My father had not bought into what I believed was the mutual goal of getting the toddler to sleep on time so that the mother herself could get some rest. Furthermore, my father had undermined his co-leader, the head of the household, and my father had engaged in dishonesty, attempting to collude with the child to lie to the mother. This is why this effort fell apart. So I can see why Jesus prays for us to be sanctified in the truth at the end, because truth is important. In that phrase, when he says sanctify them in the truth, commentators say that he is talking about sanctify them in the truth, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the Word. In other words, keep them firm in their commitment to the truth about who I am, Jesus. And I have no doubt that he meant that. But I also think, in the light of this reflection I've had and this research I've read by David Gortner, that Jesus is also just basically talking about, the truth, telling the truth, honesty. He wants God to bathe us in truth and openness and transparency. Because when we live our lives that way, it's like we're swimming in a sea together. And there's a reciprocity of openness and love between us that is like the reciprocity that Jesus describes between himself and God as he is praying. As we head into this transition time of our church, as we discern who the next rector will be, and as we prepare to say goodbye to our departing leader, I am hoping that we will see that we are all called to new ways of leading in the new life of our church. And there are ways that we can help each other in a very reciprocal way as that happens. We can tell each other what we're good at. We can invite each other into work. We can think about the others and their emotional lives and what is happening for other people. We can consider our own personal passions and how we might bring those to bear here in our church community. But remember, during this whole time, that we are supposed to be having fun. Jesus says that he wishes for our joy to be complete. So find things that complete our joy, because Jesus is inviting us in to have fun. He is opening the door, and he's asking us to come in. Amen.